when I first started writing the book, I was writing a story that was set much later in the 1960s, and there were these cousins, and the story seemed to progress pretty smoothly for me, and I was making progress, but I didn't understand why there was this trouble between these two families, these two sides of a family. And so, as an exercise, I just went back in time, one generation, and then that didn't work out, and I didn't learn very much, so went back another generation, and then I never went forward again, because I just ended up sort of stuck in that time. But this is the time period when my grandfather was born, when he was a young boy. And this is the county, the part of Texas where my grandparents met. I have 34 first cousins, big family, big Czech-German family in Texas. And so, of all those cousins, only my brother and I were raised in the city. All of the rest stayed in the country. So for me, to go back to the country, it was supposed to feel like a homecoming. All my cousins knew how to, they weren't afraid of the bulls in the pasture, and they knew how to get through the barbed wire fence without cutting their clothes up. And when I was a little boy, I just ran headlong into an electric cattle fence and was just knocked out for a few minutes. So the country for me felt like it was lonely for me, because it was supposed to be our family's homeland, but I felt very much a stranger to it. But as far as the time period, it was kind of just an accident, just circumstance. It's a conversation between writers throughout many years. And so the sort of violence between brothers, rifts between brothers, it's got biblical resonances. It's especially prevalent in fiction in the South in America. And most of what I do well comes from my subconscious, and I don't plan out the story ahead of time. I happen to love my brothers very much, and we don't beat up on each other, so I'm not sure where that comes from, other than it is dramatic, and I don't write about what I know, I write about what I want to know. It satisfies my curiosity. I'm not terribly disciplined as a writer, so if I don't have something to discover through my story, then I'm probably not going to write it. As a writer, I'm really careful not to make my good characters too good, not to make my bad characters purely bad. It's sort of my job to love all of them, as flawed as they are, because to me they're human beings. They sort of come alive. So the Knedlik twins, who seem horrifically mean and calloused and diabolical at times, but one of them is this sort of passionate reader. He just loves to read these sort of romantic, serialized novels that he's working on. It's a book that can be, the story to me demanded that it be true, and that I sort of write what happens in the story, so, there's some pretty explicit material sometimes. But I was interested in showing mostly the way that the difference between the human animal and the horse, or the owl, or the possum, the other animals in the book, the natural forces in the book, is this power of memory, whereas the human memory sort of can get stuck. Carol, for me, he's sort of stuck, he's implanted in the past, and the animals live right in the moment, always right in the moment, right? This is what our dogs teach us, like, it's always now. We spend our time thinking about yesterday, worrying about tomorrow, and the dog, it's always now. So I am interested in that interplay. I also think we spend a lot of time in literature distinguishing between humankind and nature. We see it in poetry, we see it in some of the great Shakespearean literature, we see it in many Southern and Western American novels. There's a fence, there's always a fence that separates man from nature. But man is nature, right? And so I'm interested always in thinking about that juxtaposition, that dichotomy in different ways. This is the only true story that I used in the book, and I wrote it because when my father told me this story, when I was a little boy, maybe I had done something wrong and he wanted to sort of frighten me. But he told me this story that I did not believe. He said, when I was a boy, there were these boys who lived close to us. My father grew up on a farm, very close to where the novel is set. And he said there were these boys and their father was very mean to them and they didn't have any money, and so he didn't use horses or mules. He built harnesses for the boys and they pulled the plow, and because they were straining on one side or the other, their necks were permanently bent and warped. And I thought, that's ridiculous. It's surely just my father making up a story. But when I finished the novel, I was sitting with my father having a beer, and I said, you know, Dad, I used this story you told me a long time ago. And he said, oh, well, one of those boys with the bent necks was Benny. And I said, who's Benny? And he said, that was your Aunt Dorothy's first husband. And he was a very mean, violent man who had a very mean, violent father. But I wrote it because I thought, this is impossible to believe, and as a writer, that's the best challenge in the world, is to try and make a reader believe something that I don't believe.